table talking about some of the various things that we're hearing with the Housing Committee and some of the things that the Urban Design Committee is hearing as well. And the conversation always comes back to, oh, you know, there's a policy intervention that needs to be done here to unlock some of these things. So we keep bumping into policy as something that needs to happen to sort of create opportunities. But what we're really seeing is that there's a lot of opportunities happening within the policy space itself. And policy can really be leveraged as an opportunity, and designers have a critical role to play in that conversation. So really, this conversation is one that we hope will be part of a series of conversations. We certainly see this building into some of the fine work that's happening with the Mayor's Housing Innovation Lab and some other initiatives of the BSA and other initiatives happening across the city of Boston and the sort of greater Boston metro region. So the official introduction to the session, regulations affect the work of architects, planners, and designers. While policy advocacy may not be part of your day-to-day workflow and policy making may seem far afield from your skill set, you may be surprised. Urban planning and housing are governed by complex regulatory constraints that often necessitate your skills as designers so that policies have their desired intent. The learning objectives today, by the end of today's sessions, participants will be able to understand the most common housing policy issues that residents and community stakeholders identify when advocating for or against affordable housing. You will learn how local policies have been used to deliver and build more high-quality affordable housing, and you will learn how policymakers and advocates communicate effectively with community stakeholders. Today, we'll be hearing from 3 presenters to help sort of shape the conversation with us. First, we'll hear from Rachel Bogardus Drew, Research Director of Public Policy with Enterprise Community Partners. She's going to help us frame out the conversation. What does the conversation in policy circles look like? What are folks talking about? What's some of the language? What are some of the concerns? What are some of the opportunities? Next, we'll hear from Linnea Gotterstad. She's an equity advocate, a housing advocate in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area. She's part of the Neighbors for More Neighbors, or N4MN organization out there. And next, we'll hear from City Councilor from Cambridge, Mark McGovern, who will explain a little bit more about the affordable housing overlay that has been enacted in Cambridge and some of the ways in which local policymakers are using design and specifically the work of planners and architects to improve their community. I have a few sort of logistical notes, which I'll go over, and then I'll invite Rami, the co-chair of the Urban Design Committee, to share some welcoming remarks if he has any. We'd invite folks to offer questions via the chat box. We are going to try to collect those as they come up. So please write some things down there. We're going to do our best to weave some of those questions as they come together. I'd invite folks to offer questions as they come up. So you can type them right into the chat. I'll also say that the speakers, Rachel, Linnea, and Mark, I think you should feel free to sort of not look at the chat and let Rami, Ganesh, and myself try to facilitate that conversation. So you just don't need to sort of focus on that. But please mute locally. If we have time at the end, we'll open up the microphones for some questions. We will be recording the session and sharing it on the BSA website. So please put on your camera and please smile. And then we will be putting a link into the chat box for those seeking CEs. So if that's you, there's Jenny taking care of that for us. So if you're looking for CEs, if that's part of your session tonight, please check out that link. We'll be sure to include it later on at the end of the session as well for folks that have missed it at the top. Rami, I'll open the floor to you to just sort of off, if you have anything you'd like to offer before we go ahead and get started and turn it over to Rachel.
Sure. Thank you, Ray. And thank you, Jenny and Wandy and Ganesh for helping us organize this. When Ray and Ganesh first approached me and my co-chair, Martin, the affordable housing as an issue seemed an obvious kind of overlap for us to work on together. I mean, I think I don't have to tell any of you the sort of relationship, you know, in the Boston area as in many parts of the country, the need for more affordable housing is intense. And it has all sorts of urban design ramifications and implications. And I think for us, this idea of the interplay between policy and design is particularly interesting. So how does one affect the other and back and forth? I am excited to hear three people who know far more about this subject than I do speak to us tonight, and I hope you enjoy it as well.
Thanks, Rami. Really, really thank you for that. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to introduce Rachel. She is going to speak first and give us sort of the overview here, and then we'll go from Linnea to Mark. And sort of the idea is we're trying to create a broad conversation and funnel down into something a bit more specific and local. I'd invite Rachel, Linnea, and Mark, each of you, as you start, maybe you can share a little bit about yourself, your policy interest, or sort of where you're coming and entering the conversation. You'll be, all of our participants will be quick to notice that we don't have three architects or planners presenting tonight. We have distinctly non-architects and non-planners presenting. But I think it'd be great if each of you could just share a sentence or two about where you're coming from and what your perspective is. It certainly will be much more eloquent than me trying to fumble through it.
All right, I guess that's my cue. Thanks, Ray. Thank you for the opportunity, everyone, to be here tonight to talk with you. My name is Rachel Bogardus-Drew. I am the research director for public policy at Enterprise Community Partners. So I work with Ray at Enterprise. I work mostly on federal policy, but I'm not actually located in the DC area. I do actually live in the Boston area and work in the Enterprise Boston office with Ray. So I'm also a native of the area, like many of you, I'm sure, as well. In my role at Enterprise, I lead and conduct research mostly in support of our policy priorities as an organization, which includes some of our policy advocacy work around the preservation and development of affordable housing, as well as community development and making sure that where we make affordable housing and where we access affordable housing is also a neighborhood of opportunity where folks can not just have the affordable housing they need, but also have access to the tools for community resilience, for upward mobility, and in particular, our organization is very keen on advancing racial equity through affordable housing and opportunity. So part of the work that I do in developing the research in support of our policy work is to make the case about why policy is important and the importance of housing policy, not just to housing outcomes, but also to outcomes relating to things like education, labor force development, healthcare, climate resilience, and disaster recovery, and so forth. And in that process, I often come across groups that say, well, you know, I don't know what my role is in housing policy. How could, you know, I know that there's a problem. I know more should be done, but what's my role in it? And so part of what I'll talk about tonight is just some perspectives on that. And I'm going to do it by sharing some research that I've done recently around gentrification and neighborhood change, some of which I presented about 18 months ago or so, I think, at another BSA event. So if you were there, some of this might look familiar, but some of it is new and some of it has a little different spin on it too. So hopefully it won't sound repetitive. But the idea here is to look at how how people conceive of gentrification, their perceptions and their understanding of what it is, and to show how the different ways people think of gentrification can lead to very different outcomes with respect to not just where we think gentrification happens and to whom and why and how, but also to the policy interventions that then are ascribed to address whatever the assumed outcomes are that need to be addressed, whether they're assumed to be negative or positive, whatever those are. So if you don't mind advancing the slide, Jen. Thank you. So one of the things that I've discovered in my research, and I should start by saying I'm a reformed academic. I was at Harvard for many years and at UMass Boston as well. So I kind of default back to the academic world of research often. So one of the things I found in looking at the academic research around gentrification, though, is that there was really no common definition. There was a common conception, some idea generally of what gentrification was, where it happened and how and why, but there was a lot of disagreement on the precision part of it. Why, who specifically, what neighborhoods specifically could gentrify? Of those that could, which ones do gentrify, and how do we observe that? So I present to you here 3 definitions that I pulled from well-known literature in this field, just to give a flavor of that. So you'll know, if you look at these, you'll see each of them starts with an idea that gentrification only happens in certain types of communities, that there's only, that it can't happen everywhere, that there are some places that are too prosperous or too well invested for gentrification to occur. It's only in these working class or low income or low SES neighborhoods where gentrification occurs. These definitions also generally agree that the gentrification happens when there's an influx of new residents into that lower income neighborhood. Whether those residents are different in some respect to the existing residents of that neighborhood, that's actually where the phrase gentrification comes from. It's the influx of the upper class gentry into working class neighborhoods. That's where it came from. And then the idea that gentrification can be observed through either changes in these residential characteristics or maybe in some other ways, whether it is by housing prices or the pace of housing development, or maybe with commercial activity in the area, that these are ways we can observe that change happening and be able to say, aha, that's gentrification. But even with that kind of common conception around gentrification, you can see in these definitions already that there's very different distinctions made about, well, how low income and what income do we use to measure that? Or is it about the employment profile of the neighborhood, if it's working class? Or is it, and when we talk about the change that happens, well, is it residents of a different social class? Is it residents of a different racial or ethnic class? Is it more about the housing? These are all different ways to observe these almost proxies for what people think of as gentrification, but when you try to apply them, you come up with very different results. So if you don't mind advancing the slide. So one of the things that I did in my work was to develop the gentrification comparison tool, which is a visual way of representing how different definitions of gentrification can actually lead to very different outcomes. This tool, and I'll show you an example of it in just a moment, but it uses a common set of data and it applies it over 93 different cities and 4 different decades of census data collected. So it allows a user to go in and pick the city and the time frame that they're most interested in and be able to look at how 3 different measures would identify gentrified neighborhoods for that time frame. And it not only identifies the gentrified, but it also identifies those that were eligible to gentrify, again, with that concept of below some threshold for income or status at the beginning of the decade, and distinguishes between, within that subset, between those that made the change to gentrification and those that did not. And then finally, it calculates a degree of overlap between these 3 different definitions to make the point that how you define these terms and the variables you apply to operationalize them will very often lead to entirely different sets of neighborhoods identified. These overlap measures generally come out very, very low, even in a large city with lots of neighborhoods. So it's part of that representation of how there are these little differences in how you define and conceive of gentrification can lead to very different identified outcomes. And I want to make clear that the point of this exercise was not to say one of these definitions is correct and the other ones are bunk, and that everybody should use the one that I think is the most appropriate. That's not it at all. It's to make that point that how you define these things matter. And in particular, when you take a large national level quantitative data set like census data, and you apply it over 93 cities and 4 different decades, you're going to get a lot of, you're going to miss a lot of that local context and local knowledge that actually is crucial to identifying what's going on in these neighborhoods. I mean, I don't think it's going to be a surprise to say that gentrification in Boston looks probably very different than gentrification in, say, Los Angeles or even Minneapolis. But these broad data sets and these broad conceptions don't allow for that local context. So by presenting this visually, I invite folks to look at the neighborhoods they know and provide their local context in trying to identify what's going on in their neighborhoods. This tool also helps to display the dynamic nature of neighborhoods, that gentrification is not a steady state or a final state. You can have a neighborhood that starts out as low income and eligible to gentrify, and maybe it stays that way for a decade, and then the next decade it gentrifies, but then the next decade it goes back to being low income again. Or maybe it goes from gentrified to not eligible to gentrify because now it's up here, but then it goes back to gentrified again. The point is that neighborhoods are always changing. And so to say, oh, a neighborhood is gentrified is a reference point, a reference to that neighborhood at a point in time, but that doesn't mean it's going to stay that way for the long term. And then the third thing that I like to point out from this tool is that for all the attention gentrification gets, and rightly so, it's an important phenomena, but when you look at the results of this tool and you look at the neighborhoods identified, what strikes me in particular is how few of the eligible neighborhoods actually make that leap to gentrification in most cities in most decades. The majority of those neighborhoods identified as eligible, low income enough at the start of the decade, stay that way. They don't have the observed changes that meet the criteria under these definitions for what a gentrified neighborhood should be. And that consistent disinvestment, that consistent disadvantage in these neighborhoods is an issue too, and one that I think doesn't get as much attention, sometimes lost in the fervor over a lot of gentrification and what does that mean and should we build or shouldn't we build and so forth. So if you don't mind, next slide, please. So here's the capture from the gentrification comparison tool. And of course I chose Boston, figuring that would be the most familiar to this audience. And I show it here for the decade of 2000 to 2010. And right away you can see that these 3 different definitions represented by these 3 panels in different colors present very different pictures of what was going on in the city of Boston in the first decade of the century. You have on the one hand definitions, the definition defined by Lance Freeman, the one that's presented in the shades of green, that shows that most of the city of Boston was actually eligible to gentrify, again, low income enough at the start of the decade, which are represented here by any of the areas that are not left in plain white, but all of the ones in the dark and the light green colors were eligible to gentrify at the start of the decade. The dark ones are those that made that leap to a gentrified neighborhood based on the observed change in characteristics in that neighborhood over the decade. Those meet his threshold requirements for what a gentrified neighborhood could be. Compare that to the middle one, which is from Ellen and O'Regan, and you see not only a much smaller number of potentially gentrified neighborhoods, the eligible ones, which again, anything that's not shaded in white, but you see only a very small number of the eligible ones that appear to have gentrified. And then even smaller when you go to the third one there, the McKinnish one in purple. So right away you can see that there's this very different perspective that you get depending upon which of these measures you look at. Next slide, please. So to bring this back to the kind of point at hand, what does this mean for a group of architects and designers and their role in policymaking? Well, as I said, and as the tool demonstrates, it's very important when we are talking about neighborhoods and we're talking about what's going on and what the policy interventions are needed for them, that we get a lot of perspectives. And so as architects and designers who work in these neighborhoods and potentially live in these neighborhoods, but have a sense for what's going on within them at the market level, your perspective is extremely important, because without it, you end up with these very different conceptions of gentrification that have no local context to them. We obviously need to hear from residents as well, but it's important that we get a range of perspectives, because they're not necessarily the only people aware of what's going on in the neighborhood. It also points out how we need to have flexible policies, because you're not going to be able to say that one particular approach is going to work in every single one of these neighborhoods. You might have some neighborhoods where the suggestion of gentrification indicates that we should build a lot more housing in order to absorb the increased demand from new residents to that neighborhood. But at the same time, we need to make sure that our policies also allow for the preservation of the existing affordable housing in that neighborhood. So we need to make sure that there's some flexibility there to meet these different ranges of demands. And then the last one goes back to my point at the beginning about how we need to be very precise when we're talking about neighborhood conditions, and try not to rely on this lazy language of saying gentrification, when perhaps what we're talking about is a neighborhood whose income profile is rising, but not because of an influx of new residents, but because of changes in the circumstances of the existing residents, or saying one that's gentrifying because of new commercial activity that isn't really attracting more housing demand, or one that does have higher housing demand, but isn't necessarily coming from a very different population base than the existing residents. Let's not call all of these things gentrification. They're very different. Let's be very precise about what we're saying. And in particular, when we're talking about what kinds of policies are needed, let's be very precise in addressing those as well. That is, if you just go one more slide, please. And if you are interested in this research, if you'd like to play with the gentrification comparison tool yourself, or read more on this topic, that some of the work that I've written on it, the website there will direct you to that work. Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel. That's great. Really appreciate that. I always love seeing those maps, but I will sit on my question. Folks, feel free to write questions in the chat. We'll bring them up in the Q&A at the end. Linnea, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thank you. Can you hear me all right?
Loud and clear.
Awesome, great. Okay, well, yeah, we can go, right, you guys all right? Maybe, one more time. There we go, okay. So my name is Linnea. A little bit about myself. I work in the meetings and events industry and have no experience at all with or architecture. So.
Is anyone else having trouble hearing Linnea?
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me?
I can't really hear.
Okay. Let me try to change my audio.
That's
Does this
much
work?
better.
Is that working for people?
Yeah, that's much better.
Great.
Okay, great. I'll go ahead and just pull my phone closer. So a little bit about myself. I work in the meetings and events industry, and I don't have any experience at all with design or architecture. I came to housing and zoning advocacy through being passionate about climate change. In the past 5 years or so, I started volunteering more for organizations working on climate change. And as I learned more about what reduces carbon emissions, I learned that the rules and norms around how we build our cities have a huge impact on how much we can reduce our carbon emissions. So in the spring of 2018, Neighbors for More Neighbors had its first public event at Glick's in downtown Minneapolis. It's a downtown bar, and I attended and have been a Neighbors for More Neighbors volunteer ever since, mostly serving on the speaking and media team. as well as helping plan and coordinate engagement events. So Neighbors for More Neighbors is an organization in Minneapolis that advocates for secure, abundant, and affordable homes, and was one of a coalition of organizations that successfully advocated in favor of the upzoning in the Minneapolis 2040 Comprehensive Plan that ended exclusionary zoning in Minneapolis. So how did that happen, right? To answer that question, I'll give a quick presentation put together by Jana Fleestrand and other Neighbors for More Neighbors volunteers. All right, so in Minneapolis, we are in a housing crisis. We do not have enough homes, flat out. We also have incomplete neighborhoods. Complete neighborhoods have all the pieces a healthy community needs. So a balance of a variety of types of housing, green spaces, and businesses within walking distance that create a human scale economy where people can flourish. Incomplete neighborhoods, places that lack shops, cafes, and walkable streets, leave us isolated and take dollars out of our community. So, and as our climate continues to change, complete neighborhoods will allow us to change the way we move around our city and allow us to be better stewards of our resources. So we organized to start making progress on both of these problems by ending single-family only exclusionary zoning, which brings us to the Minneapolis 2040 Comprehensive Plan. So Minneapolis has legalized small apartments anywhere in our city through our comprehensive plan, Minneapolis 2040. So our comp plans in the state of Minnesota, our work plans as the city is required to create every 10 years that guide policy and action in the city of Minneapolis. So transportation, economic development, housing, climate, racial justice, and much more. So to gain public support for the plan, we had to make two things that are invisible visible. One is the racist history of our city and its remaining impact. The other is that the political will does exist to create a different future. White Americans generally and white Minneapolitans in particular don't know our racist segregationist history. That is where Mapping Prejudice, a program based at the University of Minnesota, comes in. They engaged almost 3,000 volunteers and combed through over 170,000 historic documents, uncovering the history of how Minneapolis became segregated. They were searching for racial covenants and found about 30,000. 110 years ago, Minneapolis was not segregated. The first racially restrictive deed appeared in about 1910 in response to Black residents buying land and building homes in Minneapolis. As you can see on the news story pictured in this slide, there was news around kind of the reaction to this happening in the city. So the deed in that transaction contained what would become a common restriction, shown here, restricting what racist people could buy homes and buy land. So covenants created demographic patterns that remain in Minneapolis today. Residential segregation reinforces other disparities in employment, education, and health. Mapping Prejudice created this map shown on this slide, showing how these deeds sprouted and spread across the city and the county. Mapping Prejudice's workshops also pointed out how, after the Minnesota legislature prohibited racially restrictive covenants in 1953, the city of Minneapolis stepped in with exclusionary zoning for wealthy white neighborhoods. That zoning is largely still in place today, and the places highlighted here on the map in this current slide remain some of the least dense and whitest parts of the city today. So images like this map and being an active part of research processes is prompting many white Minneapolitans to reflect on how, while we didn't create it, we benefit from this system. People didn't know about the racially restrictive deeds or the zoning that is systematically exclusionary until Mapping Prejudice and their volunteers connected the dots. So, in the Minneapolis 2040 draft, planners also connected the dots of how historic segregation created racial housing disparities today. They used a racial disparity frame for every topic of the plan, including the abundant homes piece, which is pictured on this slide. This was a step towards dismantling exclusionary zoning. And now, spotlighting our history, the exclusionary impact of that history, and the structural racism that maintains white wealth is one step. To keep legalization of building abundant homes in the Minneapolis 2040 plan, we also needed to make the political support for this change visible. So there is widespread support for welcoming more people into Minneapolis. Neighbors for More Neighbors made it our job to turn people out. Supporters are often people whose voices are missing. Young people, transplants, renters. We had to let people know why it was important to show up and that their voice mattered, and when, where, and how to show up. So we organized walk-in talks with our council members. We hosted comment-in-a-box parties. We wrote blog posts and pitched our neighbors. We talked to the media. We got people out to testify at public meetings. Organizing in City of Minneapolis also had elected a progressive city council in 2017, a year before the Minneapolis comp plan vote happened. And these council members needed and saw community support for this plan. In the end, they voted 12-1 to pass Minneapolis 2040. So with the end of that kind of presentation, brings us to today. Last year, 2020, was the year the city was required to implement the Minneapolis 2040 comp plan. So last year was the year that the ambitious goals of this plan were to be written into city ordinance, which is a process that happens with much less public attention. So this is where architects come in. Not that they weren't there the whole time during the whole engagement process, but city staff's initial draft of the ordinance language implementing the new zoning plans laid out in 2040 left something to be desired. So this slide shows the initial floor area ratio limits proposed by city staff in the interior zones of Minneapolis, which are the least dense zones in Minneapolis. To someone like me, this table does not mean very much. But to the architects and designers in our coalition, they knew that this meant that duplexes and triplexes with pretty small units, studios or one bedrooms at best, and not much new housing for families is what was realistic in these interior zones. And that someone trying to build a duplex or triplex in interior zones 1 and 2 ultimately couldn't have any more square footage than a single family home on that same lot. And then separately, the draft language proposed affordability incentives for the denser part of the city, but no affordability incentives in these same interior zones 1 and 2. And it may not surprise you to learn that interior zones 1 and 2 are the same areas that are still the whitest, wealthiest, and least dense, and the highest concentrations of those same racial covenants in the past. So we needed a team of people with the expertise to tell us what this FAR, floor area ratio, would mean to someone designing a multi-unit building, what a real-world building with these restrictions would look like, and what FAR they would need to make a duplex or triplex with 2 or 3 bedroom units pencil out. So our task force convened a tech meeting with architects, small independent developers and designers, people from advocacy housing organizations, as well as people who are members of a group called Architecture Lobby in Minneapolis, to help identify specifically what in the draft ordinances would cause barriers to adding more homes, and to help us determine what ordinance language would ultimately encourage more homes rather than just keep the status quo. So the technical team came up with a stepped or tiered FAR limit recommendation that was a lower FAR limit for single family homes and higher based on the number of units. So having a recommendation that was based on real world fact-based estimates helped us build a coalition across organizations who backed up our recommendations by signing on to a public comment letter that we sent to the Minneapolis Planning Commission and to the City Council, and which was cited by the Planning Commission as they worked through the amendment process to make changes to this original draft. So the architects from our task force team also partnered with volunteer writers to help come up with real price estimates, theoretical basic designs that helped us demonstrate how multi-unit housing can be more affordable compared to a single family home, and how over strict built form rules can shackle what can be built. And they helped us create graphics that visually demonstrated these ideas, like the one in this slide here, which was huge. And this informative piece is really an important part of our advocacy strategy and really helped people see how these kind of like technical jargony rules affect real world housing in our city. And I'm excited to say in December we had a partial win. The city ultimately adopted an affordability premium incentive that would allow for higher FAR for multi-unit homes, not by right like we had hoped, but in return for affordable units, which is a good thing. And this premium encourages multi-unit homes throughout the interior and least dense zones of the city, which was a change from what they had proposed initially. The city also adopted a sustainability premium incentive for the interior zones of the city that allows higher floor area ratio in exchange for sustainable buildings. And excitingly, these premiums stack. So if a building qualifies as sustainable and has an affordable unit, you can have a even kind of bigger building with even bigger units, you know, if you qualify for both, as you can kind of see pictured in that slide there. So architects and designers were really crucial members of our team, and without them, we would not have been able to make the changes to our ordinances that would make it easier for us to address our housing crisis and create more complete neighborhoods and undo kind of the exclusionary zoning that has existed in Minneapolis. So yeah, with that, thank you for your time and for inviting me to speak today.
Thanks, Linnea. It's really helpful to hear. And I think it's really great to hear how somebody gets into the advocacy space and really has a passion for the place that they live and the issues. So really, thank you for your advocacy. And I know I have some questions for you, and I know others are queuing them up too. But before we go to any of the questions, I want to invite Councillor McGovern to share some words on what's happening in the city of Cambridge.
Thank you. I learned a lot during the first presentations, not the least of which is I need to take a workshop on how to create a interesting looking PowerPoint. So this is this is what I make up, what I lack in presentation, I make up for in volume. I have a few more slides, so I'm going to try to whip through these. So thanks for having me here, and I'll just say that, you know, I'm born and raised in Cambridge. I'm a social worker by trade. Most of my work has been around issues of homelessness, substance use disorder, affordable housing, and those are the perspectives that I bring to the council and the issues that I work on the most. So the affordable housing overlay was something that was really important for me as a counselor to help get passed. So why don't we go into it? Next slide. So what is the overlay? The affordable housing overlay is a citywide zoning overlay that offers height and density bonuses and permitting predictability to those who wish to build 100% affordable housing projects. Next slide. The purpose is to make it more financially viable to build 100% affordable housing and to make it possible to build affordable housing in neighborhoods where there is currently little to no affordable housing. We also have a history of redlining in Cambridge that Linnea talked about, the sort of the racist history of zoning, and this is the overlay is also a way to try and deconstruct some of that. So why is it necessary? The affordable housing developers often cannot compete with market rate developers who can afford to pay more land and to pay more for land and for buildings. There's also areas of the city where current zoning makes the creation of affordable housing infeasible. So allowing affordable housing providers to build more densely than market rate developers as of right will create opportunities in neighborhoods that are currently essentially off limits. And affordable housing developers have also faced long and costly permitting challenges that delay the ability to complete new units. We've had many projects that have gone to court, which has either caused those projects to be scrapped in their entirety or to have floors cut off, which is really, and we often use the word units, but we're talking homes here. That I see a unit as a family or a unit as a person who gets to live in our city or not. And so the permitting challenges have been often cause problems. Next slide. So if you can see here around some of the, from 2016 to 2019, so under new opportunities, these are opportunities that affordable housing developers identified as opportunities for them to potentially buy to build affordable housing. So in 2016, there were 14 such opportunities. Affordable housing developers bid on 7 of those opportunities and were able to purchase 2. In 2017, there were 13 opportunities. They made 2 offers, purchased 1. 2018, 15 opportunities. They made offers on 3, purchased 1. In 2019, there were 9 opportunities. They made no offers and purchased 0. And so this chart shows that even there are not a lot of opportunities in Cambridge to begin with, but even when there are opportunities, affordable housing developers rarely get to actually purchase that property because they get outbid by private developers. Next slide. This is just a chart of where affordable units are in the city of Cambridge. So the port, which is just outside of Central Square, you see that 34.5% of the total units in the port are considered affordable. And you come all the way down to, actually, I think this, can the slide, we're missing one of the rows. West Cambridge, it's 1.3% is the least, the least affordable. And as we were going through the affordable housing overlay political process, really all of those neighborhoods that are below 10% were the neighborhoods, with the exception of MIT, that's a little bit of an anomaly because of the university, but all of the below 10% were really all the neighborhoods that were fighting fiercely against the affordable housing overlay for fear of what would affordable housing do to the, quote, character of their neighborhood. So these are neighborhoods that are essentially you know, off limits to people. And in Cambridge, what is considered affordable housing for a single person is someone making roughly less than $70,000 a year. And so you're talking about teachers, you're talking about social workers, in addition to people who might have housing vouchers. So that's where we found the biggest opposition. Next slide. So what height under the overlay? I wanted to show this to you because really I was amazed that we were facing such opposition, because what we were talking about is actually relatively modest. So in areas of the city that are currently zoned of a height of 40 feet or less under the overlay, and again, it's only for someone who builds 100% affordable housing and it stays affordable in perpetuity. So this is not market rent development. But if you built under the overlay, you could build 45 feet in height, or 50 feet if you had ground floor activation, retail, daycare center, you know, what have you. So in some places, you're talking a difference of 5 feet, right? 5 to 10 feet. If you lived in, if the zone was 45 to 50 feet in height, you could build 65 feet or 70. Greater than 50 feet, there was an 80-foot max. And so you're really talking about 1 to 2 stories in most cases throughout the city. Next slide. Density, and again, I'm with Linnea that my eyes kind of glaze over when we start getting into all the math and the FAR and everything else. I'm a social worker. You guys understand this better, but basically we cap density at 2 times the FAR than what would be typically allowed. Next slide. The permitting process. So right now, if you're building, you know, if you want to do something that doesn't conform with zoning, you have to go to the planning board, you have to go to the BZA, there are public hearings. The planning board has to grant you permission, you know, a special permit to build your project. That can then be appealed by members of the community, and we have seen that often. So we wanted to streamline that process for affordable housing development, also because it helps with funding. When they can go to funding sources and say, we know what we're going to be able to build, we don't have to get special permission for it. It helps free up funding for them. rather than sort of keep them in this sort of limbo. So under the AHO, we still require community meetings. The developers are required to meet with the community to present their plan and get feedback. They still must submit their plan to the planning board, which is a public meeting, public comment, public review. They have to present at the public meeting, and that's, like I said, the public has an opportunity to comment. The planning board can comment on compliance with development guidelines and urban design objectives. We have a list of, I think it's over 70 different design guidelines as recommendations for developers to follow. Planning board can comment on those. The developer then can revise and submit plans for a second review meeting. And the planning board can make a final report, but it is non-binding. And by making it non-binding, it means it's not appealable. And so it means that there's more predictability there. These are more as of right projects. So the process, 2017, 2018, the Envision Cambridge, which was the city's citywide plan that looked at, a whole number of issues in the city. The Housing Working Group discussed and recommended the AHO. That was one of the recommendations that came out of that group. From January to March in 2019, the Housing Committee of the City Council held 5 public hearings. In April 2019, the AHO petition was filed and sent to the Ordinance Committee of the City Council. That was 5 additional meetings. The Planning Board had 3 meetings on the AHO. The city hosted 15 neighborhood meetings from September 2018. That should be, September 2018 to June 2019. There were 7 open houses that were held, and in September 2019, the AHO expired without a vote. We needed 6 votes to pass it. We had 5, so we did not call a vote on the overlay, and we let the petition expire because there was not the support for the council, and it died for the remainder of that term. Next slide. In 2020, February 2020, I was the lead on refiling the AHO. COVID hit, everything went to hell, and the AHO expired because there's a timeline attached to it, expired in May of 2020. I refiled it again in June of 2020. We had 2 ordinance committee meetings, one in July, one in August, a planning board hearing, and we took a final vote on the AHO on October 5th, 2020, and it passed on a 7-2 vote of the council. So that is kind of what it is, and the process. It was a huge election issue in that meantime. From in November 2019, there was an election, and it was a major election issue where you had slates of candidates lining up who would support the overlay and who would not. The result was we picked up that 6th vote that we needed, which is why we refiled it, because then we knew we had the 6 votes to pass it. But it was a huge election issue. Next slide. The main objections, again, they came really mostly from the neighborhoods that had less affordable housing. Neighborhood character was sort of the tagline. What is this going to do to the neighborhood character, which I always find interesting. Who decides what the neighborhood character is? And, there was a time that triple deckers were looked at as, these horrible things. And now, thank God we have them. I sort of joke that, I was in Paris actually, and for a day, and I did one of those tours. And as we're going by the Eiffel Tower, I got my little headphones in, and they talk about how there were all these people petitioning that the Eiffel Tower shouldn't be built because of shadows and height. And I thought, gee, some of the folks in Cambridge opposing the AHO spent thousands of dollars to go visit the Eiffel Tower, and they would have been the ones signing those petitions, because that's what shadows and sky and shadows on my garden, and this is too big for the neighborhood. Loss of appeal, we won't be able to sue against projects was talked about. Then you started to get into some things that were a little, for me, more problematic in terms of the social. We're a safe neighborhood. So does that mean that people who live in affordable housing are not safe? That that's gonna be dangerous? Where will those people shop? They'll shop wherever they shop. They're not gonna feel comfortable in our neighborhood. Well, certainly if that's your attitude, they won't. So there was a lot of race, underlying sort of race issues and class issues that were sort of coming up. I often say that Cambridge, for a progressive city, we talk a good game, but we don't always live the values that we say we have in Cambridge. And so there was a lot of just tension around that. And then trees were an issue. And then we've done enough. We have enough affordable housing. We don't need any more. We're too dense as it is. We should stop building everything altogether. And we shouldn't that's enough. Next slide. And so what to do? We really need to get more diverse voices to the table. I don't know if you've read this book. You've probably heard of it, Neighborhood Defenders. Have you heard of this book? If you haven't, please read it. The people who come out and turn out to meetings are of a very similar demographic. You were talking about people who tend to be older. They tend to be white. They tend to be homeowners. They tend to be middle to upper middle class. A lot of those folks, particularly in Cambridge, we have a very well-educated population in Cambridge. We have folks who are experts. I remember Governor Patrick saying, I don't take questions in Cambridge because whoever asked me the question wrote a book about it and they're just trying to catch me. So, you have people that come out, they feel there's an entitlement there. I know what I'm talking about. I'm used to my voice being taken seriously. I'm used to being, getting what I advocate for. Where on the other hand, you have a lot of people who don't have those advantages and don't have those privileges, who don't come out to meetings for a whole host of reasons, but some of it is they're just not used to being taken seriously and they're not used to being heard. So we have to get more voices to the table. We have to work on more zoning changes. We are now moving forward with basically similar to what Minneapolis is doing around single family housing. We have certain areas in Cambridge where you can only build single family units. We are going to change that and allow multifamily housing to be built throughout the city. Making sure those who benefit from affordable housing are prioritized. Again, these are real people. These aren't just units. These aren't just numbers on a page. Reach out to the community prior to design so that the initial design can address the concerns right out of the gate. We run into a lot of issues where the design gets put forward and then we get feedback and then people say, I don't like this, I don't like that, I don't like this, and it turns into a fight. If you can get some of that feedback ahead of time and sort of build that in to your design, I think that's helpful. Live the values we say we have. Affordable housing is consistently the #1 issue on the Cambridge survey as the most important issue. It more than doubled COVID in the most recent survey that was taken as the most important issue in the city. And there isn't a person in Cambridge that doesn't say, I support affordable housing, but, and then they list off all these reasons as to why the housing should not be built in their neighborhood. And we have to push back against that as policymakers and as supporters of affordable housing. Cities are living things. They change, they breathe. The Cambridge of today does not look like the Cambridge that I grew up in. Kendall Square was nothing but lots. We never went there unless you wanted to chase rats or, put fire off firecrackers. Now it is the economic driver of the entire region, and the friggin' vaccine came out of there, right? So thank God it looks like that. It allows us, Cambridge is doing incredible things financially that we would not be able to do if people said, well, I like Kendall Square the way it is, right? And fought the development of that area. And so there are benefits to that development. The other challenge I would say with Cambridge is that we're the 4th largest city in the state, one of the most densely populated cities in the country. We're very small in terms of land. And so when you take out Harvard, MIT, Leslie, Fresh Pond, Dennehy Park, city buildings, Brattle Street, you know, you're not talking about a whole lot of places to build, which is why we're building taller, because short of invading Belmont, we're not going to get any more land. And so up is where we have to go. And so those are just some of the obstacles that we face. So that's the end. I hope I went through those fast enough, but not too fast.
Yeah, that's great, Counselor. Really appreciate, I think, the clarity with which you spoke about it, and really just bringing us into what the process is, because I don't think many of us have the mechanics of, you know, like a new person comes on, you have a sixth vote, like now is the time to reintroduce something, I think is a little bit of the delicacy that unless you follow the local Cambridge papers, you may not sort of catch. We did get one question, Counselor, which I'd like to ask before going to a question up to Rachel. The question was from Sarah about what percentage of the total opportunities do the 15 affordable housing proposals represent, or how many parcels are developed in a year? I think just trying to understand what those figures represent in terms of scale and opportunities.
So, you know, these things are all multi-year processes anyway, right? And so when in that slide that said, you know, that the affordable housing developers were able to buy 2 properties, I don't know exactly which 2 those are to be able to say if that was a 10 unit, you know, building or a 50 unit building. I will say in you know, some of the more recent projects, there's one out on Concord Ave heading towards Belmont that the city worked with the Affordable Housing Trust to purchase, and then partnered with HRI, which is an affordable housing developer, and it's going to be roughly a little over 50 units, passive house construction. There's another building that Frost Terrace on Mass Ave, which is a private developer that's building an all affordable unit that's, I think, 40 some odd units. Those are some of the 2 of the most recent ones. There's a couple others in the pipeline now, but I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, no, I think that it does. I think it does. Folks that are paying attention to the conversations, all of those properties ring bells. Rachel, we have a question in here for you about gentrification. I think you were describing it as a really technical term with really specific definitions, but Sarah, who's part of our housing committee, asked about it as sort of a conceptual term and sort of how it's used as a catch-all for a lot of conversations.
Sure.
I wonder if you have any thoughts on the sort of like specificity or vagueness, and it's used as a pejorative term or a derisive term intentionally in a lot of cases. Yes. I wonder if you could speak to that.
Sure, happy to. My recommendation is actually very similar to what I recommend to you folks. Ask for specificity. What is it exactly is their concern? Is it gentrification? Is it the influx of new residents, or is it displacement, the out migration of existing residents? Gentrification and displacement are not the same thing. One can happen without the other, and often they do. You can have gentrification without displacement if you build enough to absorb the increase in demand. So is there concern about displacement? Well, then they're using the wrong term, because that's not the same thing. Who are they worried about being displacing? Why are they worried about those people being displaced? And what is it that they are afraid is going to happen? And then you can start to get into the conversation about, well, what is it that we can do to allay those fears? What policy tools can we either exist already, or can we go out and advocate for that will help allay those fears? Maybe it is more dedicated affordable housing in that community to ensure that existing residents with lower incomes can stay there. Maybe it is more permissive development of new housing to absorb that demand. Those are the kinds of things that once you have a better understanding of where those concerns are coming from, then you can get better policy outcomes.
Thanks, Rachel. That's really helpful. Linnea, I couldn't help but notice that there was a great deal of specificity in the language you were using. You spoke clearly, you spoke unambiguously, you spoke about single-family exclusionary zoning, you spoke about aspirations for what you wanted Minneapolis to look like: affordable, accessible, anti-racist. I wonder if it struck me that you were very clear and really specific each and every time you spoke towards the aspirations of your community. Do you believe that speaking towards aspirations is the way that it resonates with your community members, or how did you get towards that? Or is that just how you talk about it? I'm just wondering about sort of like it seemed very aspirational and very quality specific. And I wonder if you could speak to that.
I guess, I think that for speaking as an individual, I think that we're facing a climate crisis and a housing crisis, so a dual crisis, and an ongoing public health crisis right now, which to me just means that something has to change. Like personally, I'm actually not a person that just is excited about change for change's sake, but we're in a moment where something has to change. So I guess, yeah, for me individually, to me that means we need to reimagine how things are going to look to address these problems. So as I'm speaking about, yeah, and then most of my volunteering has really focused kind of on city issues. So as I'm speaking about these issues, it's like we have to kind of start speaking about what that means. Ideally, things are going to look like. So what does a city that is climate resilient look like? I feel like we need to start describing it and talking about it out loud. Like, what is actually going to be different about it? Because it is going to look different. Like, living in it is going to feel a little bit different. And like, what exact things have to change? And I think like naming those exact things that have to change, and like what the difference would be, helps people see it and helps people kind of imagine what it could be, and helps it feel less like some kind of grand futuristic idea that could never really happen. Like, this could happen. We could live in a Minneapolis where you could choose not to have a car, and that could be like an easy, convenient choice to make, for instance. So we need to just start talking about it like it's a real thing that could happen. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. It does. I mean, you spoke with really great clarity when you spoke about there not being enough homes and you have incomplete neighborhoods. It was really like, it was a pairing that really kind of cut to the chase. You know, I'm familiar with Minneapolis, but I don't live there. And in my walking around there, I could sort of like quickly understand where you were getting towards with that. And it actually brought me back towards Councilor McGovern's comments about some of the concerns that are raised about affordable housing in Cambridge, and some of the pushback that he received and the council received. I couldn't help but notice the sort of intersection there. Yeah, absolutely. Just like a lot of what you said, Mark, was like, I've heard so many of those things in public meetings, right? Like, I've heard so many of those same comments in a completely different city. People worry about neighborhood character. People worry about, all the same, they have the same objections. And I think those objections have the same underpinnings. The same fears lie under those objections. And I think that, just talking specifically about, like, we need to end single family only
zoning, like, we should move to a model where we have a complete neighborhood where you could walk to all the things that you need. Hopefully, kind of like starts building a picture in people's minds of just like what we're specifically talking about moving towards, and help hopefully, ideally, get rid of some of that fear that we're just lurching into some kind of unknown that is frightening and unimaginable.
Yeah, lurching into fear, I think, is something we need to resolve. I think that's well put. Councillor McGovern, I wonder, I've got a question here. What suggestions do you have to further the cause of affordable housing and to diversify voices in the Boston area, but also in the Boston suburbs, with town meeting governance, which makes it harder to institute change, especially where the white population hovers around 80 to 95% in many Metro West towns. I think you can sort of like zoom out a little bit, but I think question of getting more voices in and getting a more diverse cross-section of residents into the conversation. Do you have any suggestions for us?
Yeah, it's hard. And, I often talk about, if you picked up Cambridge, Boston, and Somerville, we could probably fit inside Minneapolis, right? Or in some other, and yet, we're our own cities. We're in competition with each other for biotech and all kinds of things. And so, you look at, and I'm not a big fan of our current governor for a lot of reasons, but you look at the housing plan that just got signed that reduces the votes needed to change zoning is really an important step that I supported, because you see Cambridge building a lot, you see Boston building, you see Somerville building, but you don't, you're just starting to see Arlington's doing a little, Newton is talking about it, but you're not seeing Lexington and Concord and these other communities. And then it gets to the whole question of, you could put the housing there, but if the jobs are all in Kendall Square and in Boston, what's the infrastructure to get people there? Because we don't want everybody driving on Route 2. So we tend to not think regionally in this state as much as we should in a lot of things, whether it's housing or transportation or climate or anything, jobs. I think it's really to change that in towns that have town meeting, and you got to get people elected that are going to vote a certain way. I mean, I don't know a better answer, right? I mean, eventually these things come down to votes, right? Of whatever political body your city or town uses, and either people need to, step up or not. But it is very hard, and it gets harder the whiter the community and the richer the community, for sure. I don't have a perfect answer for that.
So you need more of the folks that are on this webinar to run for office, is what you're saying?
Yes, please, and get more social workers to run, and
yes,
more people of color and more people who come from public housing. Absolutely.
I mean, I most of the great questions have been asked. I have kind of two observations that might be helpful for the conversation. One is the sort of importance, the value of kind of information design, sort of being able to visualize certain issues. I think Sarah just brought up the issue, the maps that Linnea referred to, and of course the maps that Rachel was showing. I think I spoke to you about this, Councillor McGovern. Ray and I were part of, had the privilege to be consultants on the guidelines for the AHO process. And one of the early things we did was sort of draw kind of lines through different neighborhoods in Cambridge, specifically neighborhoods with where the question of character was coming most loudly, just to really demonstrate the wonderful eclecticism that already exists in in all Cambridge neighborhoods. I don't know how useful that was in the larger discussion, but I do think those things add up. And I think the other thing that adds up and gives me some hope is obviously a lot of politics and the sort of the grassroots changes that Linnea described in Minneapolis, in some respect were mirrored in that election in 2019, because you said it was a big issue. I mean, as a voter, I remember it was the issue, right? I mean, there were two slates of folks. You could vote for the anti-developers, vote for the affordable housing. It was really sort of interesting. It was the first time I'd seen that in Cambridge in my lifetime. And in both of those cases, and it's sort of a happy ending, if you will, that there's some, you know, the will of the people, so to speak, has affected change in positive ways in both of those places. So.
Yeah, I think it did help when to really look at, you know, other than Brattle Street, and even on Brattle Street, you see different types of construction, right? You know, it's really hard to find, what do you mean by neighborhood character, right? In terms of architecture. And architecture is also subjective, right? I mean, when I was on the school committee, we were voting on whether or not to renovate the Martin Luther King building on Putnam Ave, or whether or not to knock it down and build a new building. That's the school in my neighborhood growing up. I hated that building. To be quite honest, I did not like it at all. And when we voted to knock it down and build a new building, all these people came out and said, you know, it's a CERT building. Look at the angles of this. And, you know, all architects came out and pointed out all this, the architecture behind it. To me, it was a cement prison looking building where kids went to school. Now, I'm not saying I'm right, and I'm not saying they're wrong. But we get into this, why should the people who are living on a street now get to decide, you know, basically deny other people the opportunity to live there? I mean, if we think of it that way, why don't we go back to Cambridge being a farming community? Because that was, you know, or how far back do you want to go to the character of a neighborhood? These neighborhoods have all changed, and they all look different than they did at one point. And, you know, we can argue forever about whether or not a building looks good or not, and you'll probably get 10 different answers from 10 different people. But at the end of the day, we have an affordable housing crisis, and we have to address it. And you address that by building homes for people. And so, you know, whether I personally like the look of the 6-story building that got built 20 years ago on my street, whether I personally like the look of that building or not is irrelevant. That's providing homes for people that need it. And if I truly believe that that's important, I will deal with looking at a building that I don't think is necessarily the most beautiful building in the world, because the people who live there are important. And we have to, that's where we have to put we have to put the me aside for the we, and we don't always do that. I hope I didn't make architects angry.
No, I think you know, we can talk about the merits of CERT all night, or we could not, but I think the larger point is really about, you know, staying focused on what the objective is, to meet the community needs. We're getting a chat in the box about how character and similar terms are often invoked to hide behind when other things are at the root of the conversation. And I think that's probably the place we should leave it tonight. So I want to thank our 3 presenters. Councillor McGovern, thank you for sharing, bringing us behind the curtain and showing us how some of the work gets done and how the tough advocacy inside gets done. Thank you, Linnea, for sharing your perspective from the Twin Cities. I think a lot of us look up to what's happening there as a model, and I'm sure that you have a lot that you would change about where you are. But I just know that a lot of us are looking towards you all for inspiration and vision. And Rachel, I wish I could see you in the office every day. I feel like every time you speak, I learn something from you. I have a lot more questions about your presentation that I couldn't get in today, but thank you for sharing a little bit about what you're seeing and a little bit about the specific language that you use, and improving our conversation. I'd like to thank Rami and Martin with the Urban Design Committee for their bringing together this workshop with us on behalf of myself and Ganesh from the Housing Committee. And then I also want to make sure two other things. If you're looking for CEs, please either scroll back to the top of the chat, or Jenny can probably add one more plug for you to pull that together at the end. And then if you have not been plugged into what's happening with the Mayor's Innovation Lab here in the city of Boston, it's simply a must plug into the work that Jenny Efron and Wandy Pascal are doing around housing affordability, interesting research, interesting pragmatic solutions that they're pulling together. It's really a must plug into, so please check out that website. So on behalf of Ganesh, Rami and Martin, Jenny and Wandy, thanks everyone for your time tonight. We look forward to furthering the conversation later in 2021. Thank you.
Bye everyone, thank you.